distinguished Vice President, dear professors, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Most applications in your mobile phone represent a dead or a struggling 20th century industry. A couple of years ago, I gave up my diary and I moved to using a mobile application with which I can share my diaries with my colleagues, coordinate in the most efficient way, but also coordinate things with my family. I do not have a camera anymore, I must admit that. I'm more a snapshot type of a person. I take snapshots with my camera. I gave up my Canon. We don't do Kodak moments anymore. We do Samsung or iPhone or Huawei moments with our phones. I recently got a new watch. I didn't have one for several years. I do not use an alarm clock. I have it in my mobile phone. So we can see in many ways that this device epitomizes the major transformations that we are undergoing in several of the industries that we see. And also those industries those applications that do not represent the dead or struggling 20th century industries, they represent the new 21st century industries, such as related to social media. So my research really addresses this dynamism. It really addresses on how novelty emerges in markets and industries. And this is something that has really driven my interest for many years already. So this is something ingrained in my character. I want to understand how stuff comes about, how novelty emerges. So to kind of understand what it is at stake when we talk about emergence of novelty in markets and industries, we start with a definition. So this is something that academics do. We define the concepts. So let's begin by a definition of industry. Now, I want to point out that this whole definition, the whole concept, might be a 20th century dying concept. Will we have industries in the way that we used to consider them in the past? However, this is a famous quotation, and I use it here to kind of lay out the field that we are talking about today. So Richard Scott defines industry as a population of organizations operating in the same domain as indicated by the similarity of their services or products. Now, let's start to kind of dissect this, because academics like to kind of analyze and put things in part. So when we think about, we start with an object, we have service or product around which a novel domain emerges. Then we have a population of organizations in the same domain. So this refers to a community of firms that see, or actors more broadly, that see that we work in the same domain, that we have something in collective, in common, referring to shared understandings. So community and shared understandings come together. We observe similarity within what we do. We observe something shared that we then as a community work together with. And very importantly, we have the operating part. So this is the doing part. Various companies, firms, individuals, consumers, they have roles in this emerging domain. And they engage in some actions. So they have roles, or they start to use or adapt to new technologies. So there is some kind of doing element of it. So if we look into the emergence of new industries and markets, or novel domains of action, which I prefer as a concept because it's more open-ended, and it doesn't say that what we are observing here will necessarily be an industry or a market. We have three things to take into account, and this form the remainder of the body of this talk. So we look into technology or service, the what aspect. We look into the why and the who, the shared meanings and the community that emerges. And we look into the how, the shared practices and routines that come about. Now, usually how we approach new industries is that we kind of take the technology as a starting point. So we have an object that someone produces. There are some meanings that are related to this object, and there are some groups of actors, firms, consumers who consume that object or that service. But in Any cases of emergent fields or industries or markets, whichever concept we want to use, it can start from any of these triangle edges. So sometimes we may engage in new action, and then we start to look for devices that help that action, so we actually have demand for technology, or we do something and we start to find meaning for what we are actually doing. Or on the other hand, we have a concept such as corporate social responsibility, some set of meanings that emerge. And then around those, new ways of doing things, say more green ways of consuming or producing items or products emerge, which then impacts also the what part. So we can identify all these three elements in any emerging industry, and we cannot give a priority to any of these. They are all co-constructing the novel domain. So if we look into first the object, so let's start that, because that's the most usual starting point when we look into emergence of novelty. We can talk about disruptions. So the examples that I gave on the phone, these are major disruptions. So the way by which better technology, superior technologies take over and replace the existing technologies. So this company Kodak that we know, many of us know, at least of my generation, know as a major film company, it does not really exist anymore. It exists as a memory or as an idea, but it doesn't exist as a functioning, well-functioning company. So we can see that these ways of taking snapshots in the phone and then distributing these through the social media to our friends are in many ways superior to the previous picture photos. So we can see also that this technology makes the old ones obsolete. And it destroys competencies and it displaces established firms and products. So let's think about a typewriter as an example. It's very difficult for a typewriter company to actually realize that the geeks at the time, that the geeks in an office producing code would be actually undermining and replacing these hardware devices. In the similar way, it is easier for a typewriter company to start producing car parts than to engage in word processing software. So we can see that the competencies are completely different that you may need in these new technologies. Now, these are slightly linear understandings of technology. So there is always one best technology that comes and takes over, and the technology has a certain trajectory by which it grows and develops, always towards better outcomes. So the technology is driving these processes. Well, not so simple, unfortunately. My assumption is the social construction of technology. So we will have to understand technology as bound to a social context. So any emergence of technology or services has to be understood in a context of how it is used and how that can be elaborated on. And it's always clear to us, for many cases, VHS Betamax competition was one of them, that best technologies do not win, but other things define this. And these are bound to power relations, emerging and new ways of engaging with these technologies, new principles for evaluating these goods. So if we think about efficient typewriters, they are evaluated on very different concepts compared to word processing software. So the evaluation principles of those two are very different. And this requires emergence of novel set of meanings that then become shared and are attached to particular objects. Also, we need new routines and practices to engage with these technologies. So word processing software, as an example, requires new set of skills, new ways of engaging with this technology that is very different from typing away with an old-style typewriter. So now we come to the two other elements of my triangle. The focus on meaning first. I have two approaches to the focus on meaning. We have first a top-down, more cultural understanding. And then we look into a bottom-up sort of micro-level, micro-social explanations. So these are the two explanations that I provide on this matter. I really love this paper by Lawrence and Phillips, good friends of ours. I know Henry is smiling there. He has had many night outs with Nelson in London. And Tom Lawrence is one of my co-authors. They have this great paper on macrocultural discourse and how these sort of macrocultural changes enable industry emergence at the local setting. So they actually depict how the change and understanding of whales as something slightly cold and distant objects, animals, such as depicted by the Moby Dick book, compared to the Free Willy movie that became a huge popular cultural hit, a movie magnet in the early 1990s. So how that change resulted in a changed understanding of whales as something human, warm, interesting. And then they kind of link this to emergence of whale watching industry in the Vancouver Island in west coast of Canada. So they show how a couple of entrepreneurial boat owners were able to use this macrocultural excitement around whales and channel it and develop a local industry around whale watching. And this is one of the key tourist attractions currently in that area. So this is kind of looking into how these changes, popular cultural, macrocultural changes, enable local action and local emergence of industries. The other element that I discuss is the kind of micro-level actions and the minute changes that then provide the basis for the same thing. And this is about institutional work. And this refers to how, through everyday mundane behaviors, we are able to gradually change the way we act, the way we behave, and how these, when sedimenting and accumulating, can form new norms and laws which are more culturally, collectively shared elements that then come to guide our behavior from top down, if you wish, and new behaviors. And the whole element here is the gradual change, repetition, reenactment basically meaning the same as repetition. It's just a funny sociological concept. Results in emergence of novel routines and practices. So this is another explanation for how we can study the emergence of industry from the bottom up, looking into the activities among individuals and how these aggregate into more widely shared behaviors and beliefs. Now the third element is the what part, like the doing part, so the how part. So this is actually, unsurprisingly so, the newest approach to look into emergence of novel markets and industries. And it's actually the least explored. And let me explain why. Well, we are looking into how people act and behave in new ways. Most of the research that we have done so far selects an established existing industry and then starts to trace backwards on how we came to this moment, this glorious moment of today, where the successful new industry is flourishing. And this is creating a very linear understanding of a success case. But when we study something in the real time, we are studying something unfolding in the current moment. Now, this is very difficult to do methodologically. There are various challenges that relate to this. But there is really a methodological void of studies looking into real-time emergence of industries, so engaging in some novel domain of action and seeing how participants engage with a novel object. And we can actually see the messiness of these processes. We can identify the paths not taken. We can see the dead ends on these activities. And we can then also study how these people engage with action and negotiate meaning in the real time. And this requires participative methodology, so ethnography, becoming an anthropologist and going into funny groups of people and identifying what they are doing and figuring out how is this action leading and driving the emergence of this particular area in a particular location, in a particular community. So a couple of examples of the ongoing research projects in this area that I find really exciting. Of course, our work is collaborative, and we work with a host of wonderful PhD students, postdocs, and other professors. And this is really the key element of how this work progresses. We have a study. I have a study with a PhD student, Galina Kallio. She's working. She has been observing for 6 years how a novel form of exchange takes shape by looking into the food collectives in a particular community in Finland. And this work promises very exciting results, contributions, because it's tracing the foundations of the whole economic theory, that of exchange. And the study is looking into how new forms of transactions emerge, and kind of then explaining the whole concept of exchange bottom up in the real-time process. So very exciting work. The other one is a project together with Amber and Patrick, who are sitting here in the audience, looking into how does database-driven material science potentially move from margins to mainstream. So this is something that we are observing real-time. We are doing a real-time study on this novel domain. The whole idea behind this is how can we bring in the methods of data analytics from big data science and develop more harmonized and synchronized databases, and then kind of draw and build on those through this analytics, developing a kind of a materials Google, if you wish. And that promises major improvements in the product development of the new technologies, both in industry and science. So this is something we are doing as a real-time project. Now, to conclude, my interest really, as said, lies in understanding how novel ideas, products, and practices move from margins to mainstream. And if we want to study and understand this, we have to take these 3 elements into account. The kind of triangle that I showed in the beginning. We have to understand the object. We have to understand our assumptions about what that object is. What is a technology? How do we study that? What is the service? And so forth. We have to understand the shared meanings, the emergence of the community, and also least done research is around studying the practices, their emergence real time, and how do those come about. And there's plenty more research to be done. I'm excited by the ongoing projects with my wonderful colleagues. I'm especially interested in looking into co-production of meaning and practices, drawing on how we do things and find meaning for that, and how those meanings then drive the emergence of novel technological fields. And this can be done by focusing on real-time emergence of the current new emerging domain that we can study through participative methodologies. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.